Well, first I want to say thank you all for being here today. It's been an incredible forum so far. And I just want to introduce our panelists. Star Wars, what does SDI teach us about tech and military competition? Sitting next to me is Senator John Kyle, U.S. Senator representing Arizona, Dr. Tom Kennedy, Chairman and CEO of Raytheon, and General Hawk Carlyle, four-star retired U.S. Air Force general, and now President and CEO of the National Defense Industrial Association. So great to speak with all three of you today.
Thank you. See you.
So I think the first place to start is what actually was SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, and how did it birth modern-day missile defense and the technology we're now talking about today? And so, Senator Kyle, I would love for you to just start with a little bit of background on this, given the fact that you have been a lifelong advocate of nuclear defense, and your public service does date back to the Reagan years.
Thank you very much. You can think about SDI as a roughly decade-long effort, first begun by President Ronald Reagan, to create a new system, and it's actually more than just sensors and kill vehicles and satellites and command and control systems and so on. President Reagan actually viewed SDI, or the Strategic Defense Initiative, as an organizing principle for a much larger commitment that would involve the entire nation, and including both the military and our industrial base. And he articulated this vision in 1983. One of the things he said in his famous speech, and I quote, was, "Tonight we are launching an effort which holds the promise of changing the course of human history. There will be risks and results take time, but I believe we can do it," end of quote. His vision was that defending against a ballistic missile attack from the Soviet Union was a more moral way of deterring such an attack and potentially being able to win if deterrence didn't work, than trying to outdo them with offensive capability and getting into a situation of mutual assured destruction, and the assured part would be the most important part of that. He felt that by having a defense, you had a more moral way of blunting the potential attack from an enemy, and he always saw it, I believe, as a deterrent. Not that this would win the war, not that we would be able to destroy every incoming missile from the Soviet Union, but that it would so complicate their planning that they would never decide to try to attack us. It did, for a while, involve development of some previous U.S. Army concepts that already existed in terms of some middle-range kind of missiles, ground-based missiles, but quickly evolved into some scientific study of different concepts that certainly took significant advantage of space and included space sensors, satellites in geosynchronous orbit that could identify a launch just about any place on Earth of any kind of a major missile, and then a series of other kinds of satellites and ground sensors, radars, both on ground and ships at sea. In other words, a variety of ways to keep track of and eventually cue our missile defense against an incoming missile. And there were a variety of kinds of interceptors that were envisioned and that were experimented with. One of the most famous that was toward the end of the Reagan administration was called Brilliant Pebbles. And the idea was to have a constellation of many hundreds of satellites in space that could quickly reach an upcoming missile in its ascent phase, in its boost phase, hopefully, which is the easiest way to kill a ballistic missile before it gets to the apogee and begins releasing multiple RVs or decoys. And these concepts, along with all of the experiments, the research that was done, and the development of various kinds of, again, sensors and radar and kill vehicles that might be used, all resulted in technology that advanced not just a missile defense program for the United States, but other things as well. And in fact, there was a space program called Clementine, which actually used some of these concepts and validated their capabilities. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, the need for a missile defense against a Soviet attack obviously was deemed much less significant, and support for the program waned, and eventually when Secretary Aspen, Les Aspen, in 1993 decided to basically kill the program, he said he took the stars out of Star Wars. And that was the rough decade, the evolution of the program from the Reagan conceptualized total defense against an attack by the Soviet Union to a point where it no longer had the space component that would have characterized a Reagan program. But I do want to sort of summarize this very quick description of SDI with a brief description of where we've gotten today, because in the intervening decade from about 1994 through the early part of the 20s, we had a much more limited vision of what a missile defense would do. It wouldn't deter an attack from a China or a Russia, for example, but rather would be strictly a theater kind of concept to protect troops deployed abroad, military assets, and the like. And that language was actually in US policy at the time, a limited defense. But limited at the time that that was written characterized approximately 200 attacking missiles, because that was the number that a rogue Soviet submarine commander could launch. The term limited became much more limited as time went on to maybe a single launch by mistake. And therefore, the way that we planned it in the Congress and in the military was greatly constricted from the original intent. But in 2017, the National Defense Authorization Act changed the description of US policy, and I just wanted to conclude with this. The National Defense Act at that time stated that it's our policy to maintain and improve an effective, robust, layered missile defense system capable of defending the territory of the United States, allies, deployed forces, and capabilities against the developing and increasingly complex ballistic missile threat. This is at a time when the threat from Russia was reemerging and was pretty well understood by the Congress. And this language, I believe, launches us into another maybe 2.0, SDI 2.0, to deal with the threat from these peer competitors of Russia and China, not only the theater kind of defenses or lesser range defenses that we would need against an Iran today. North Korea, by the way, does present a long-range ballistic missile threat, but hopefully one of my panelists can discuss the kind of system that we have today, the ground-based system that we have today to try to deal with a North Korean threat. I'll conclude by saying that just as during the Reagan era, it was believed that space was a critical component for an effective deterrent against a robust threat, I believe that same deterrent effect would exist today only if the United States had space-based sensors and eventually space-based interceptors that could deal with the size of a threat that we would be facing from a Russia or a China in the event that that occurred.
And I think that's what's fascinating and why the title of this panel is what it is today, is because this was a discussion, this was a policy put in place by a president 35 years ago. It has not been a straight line in terms of the technology or what has been implemented, but just the fact that we're talking about a space-based sensor again, some of the other technologies that were put forth in SDI originally. Dr. Kennedy, let's talk tech, because when it comes to Raytheon, you're developing a lot of the technology, a lot of the hardware, whether it's a prime contractor or a key supplier for all of the different missile defense systems we have today.
So Morgan, you did bring up the fact that it's been 35 years since the SDI program in that range. And obviously technology has changed considerably over that period of time, both on the threat side and obviously on the ability to counter the threat side. And so the bottom line is the range of the threat. It's a multi-range threat, multi-level threat, but we also need a multi-level type of counter to that threat. All the way from the Patriot systems we use today, very effective in Desert Storm over 27 years ago. Also very, very effective recently. Since 2015, there's been 150 plus launches of tactical ballistic missiles in in the Middle East region that have been taken down by the Patriot system in killing those type of missiles. The fact that we do have a layered approach, the Patriot, the THAAD system, and the ground-based interceptors is part of I would call it our position today. However, I believe that there's more that we need to do. And the reason we need to do the more is because technology has changed and the threat has significantly evolved based on that technology. And the first one Senator Carlyle did mention, and it actually comes back to the SDI. And it's to have a space sensor layer to be able to pick up this advanced threat. For example, the hypersonic threats, not only just to pick them up, but to be able to track them from birth to death, death being the killing of the ballistic missile. That's number one. That's an absolute must for us to get on board and to develop that technology, which, by the way, is significantly cheaper today than it was back at the SDI days because of the commercialization of space, especially the launch element of space. The second element is to take advantage of some technology, and it was again mentioned back to the SDI days. High energy lasers have made significant progress over the years. There's significant breakthroughs that have been made, and it's ready to take the ingest of technology money to take it to the next step. Along with that is another directed weapon capability, high power microwaves. Again, ready to take into the front to counter this evolved threat that is out there. The last stage, it's a very important stage, is that we do need to develop a new capability relative to directed weapons to take out the threat and the next level of kinetic type of vehicle. And that vehicle is going to have to concentrate on a counter hypersonic ability. So that counter will have to be a hypersonic type of weapon to be able to counter the hypersonic system. So that's the technology elements of it. Now, underlying that is artificial intelligence, machine learning, cyber, and several other technologies that are coming on the brink of today.
I want to dig into all of that a little bit more. But first, General Carlyle, I want to get your thoughts on the architecture we have in place, the potential challenges, especially from a real-world perspective, and especially on a day when we do have Iran, for example, testing a ballistic missile.
Well, thanks, Morgan. It's great to be here. I'm honored to be on stage with Morgan and Senator Kyle and Dr. Kennedy. So I think what SCI did for us, and kind of to start from the theme of this panel, is he really did, just as Senator Kyle said, gave us an organizing construct. I think we're at that inflection point today. We kind of went laissez-faire for a couple of decades. You know, Cold War ended, wall came down, and then, peace dividend. How did that work out for us? Missed it by that much. But if you look at where we're at today, the proliferation of missile technology, and I will tell you the combatant commanders out there, and I did it in the Pacific, you have to think about every day. You have to have a sensor suite that includes that space-based capability that Dr. Kennedy is talking about across the board. You have to have a ground-based capability. You have sea-based, the sea-based X-band. You have to have that all interconnected so it shares and talks and learns from each other. You have to be able to characterize the launch as rapidly as you can and then determine what the trajectory is and what the probable impact point is, and then you have to have the shooters, and you have to have the command and control to do all that simultaneously. We're not there yet. We're working on it, obviously, but like President Reagan did with the SCI initiative in '83, I think this is the inflection point. This is where we have to make the decision to strategically look at technology that Dr. Kennedy's talking about. We need the capability to look across the entire spectrum of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles and ICBMs because our adversaries and potential adversaries will use every single one of them. And when we put that architecture together, and this is a little different than what happened in 1983, I think when you put that architecture together, in 1983, I don't think we really thought about the cost imposition because the Soviet, if you remember, their economy was draining and their social structure was falling apart. And Gorbachev had to turn to something because he knew he was in a bad way. I think as we go forward with these technologies and move forward, then the cost imposition part of this strategy is going to be a key component of this. If you think about it, especially what we looked at in the Pacific all the time was a proliferation of missiles by the thousands that they could do they would swarm in on a particular target. So you have to, you can't, Patriot and THAAD are great systems. Aegis ashore, great systems, GBI are great systems, but if they're just swarming you with missiles, every time you send a $10 million missile down to take out a $50,000 rocket that's inbound, then you're losing the cost imposition strategy. So I think that's got to be part of the dialogue as we go forward, whether it's railgun, directed energy, I think, as Dr. Kennedy mentioned, is a big part of that. Space-based layer changes that. A space-based not only sensor layer, but a space-based kinetic capability is one. I think that's one of the great byproducts of the significant increase in discussion on space is everybody's thinking about this stuff now. And I think as John Hyten says, people said, you can't talk about warfare in space. It's warfare. It just includes every domain. It's not warfare in space. It's warfare across every domain that we operate in. And how do we accomplish that? And so I think as we go forward, hearkening back to 1983 when President Reagan made this speech, I think we have to have that same focus. We have to have that same movement forward because the proliferation of missile technology is what is going to drive much of the future combatant commander challenges as we go forward.
I want to put up a graphic right now. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So this is a question in the Reagan National Defense Survey that was asked that the U.S. can shoot down, if I can read my handwriting, nuclear missiles launched by another country. If you take a look here, it looks like the vast majority of Americans that were polled are confident. 42%, a great deal of confidence, and 43%, some confidence. I'll start with you, Senator Kyle. What do you think of those results?
Well, this is one of the urban myths. We can shoot down enemy missiles. Yeah, we can shoot down a few. In a couple of years, we will have 44 ground-based interceptors stationed in Alaska and California, which, based upon the number of shots that you need to take against an incoming missile to be sure you get it, might mean that we could defend against maybe something like 20 North Korean missiles. So I think most Americans would be surprised to know that that's it. Now, that's an intercontinental ballistic missile. In theater and shorter range, we have a much larger capability with THAAD and with our Aegis system and the Patriot system. But those, while they can shoot down an enemy missile, and theoretically Russia could tip a missile with a tactical warhead, even in theater, that's not the kind of thing we're talking about and that we're concerned about here as an existential threat to the United States. And I think that's where the American people misperceive our capability. We have the ability to create that kind of number, but we haven't done it so far, and it'll take a lot of political will and money and more application of technology to get there.
Dr. Kennedy, are Americans too optimistic right now?
I'm optimistic that we can take out a threat and that we can kill a ballistic missile.
A ballistic
missile coming at us. The technology exists. So we have to multiply that technology. And I described some of the ways of multiplying it before relative to having a space layer of sensors that does continuous track of these missiles that are launched. Bringing in the directed energy capabilities that I mentioned will also help in that area, but also looking at the boost phase part of the launch and working cyber effects and other techniques in that area. And potentially borrowing from some of the SDI architecture relative to having some type of effectors in space that can be launched down, and at the same time doing it in a very cost-effective way. I think what's changed since the SDI days, which actually had I would call it a very good architecture, is technology has changed where I believe it's viable to be able to achieve that type of a system with a reasonable cost. Now you're going to ask what's reasonable. And I'm going to say the reasonable is going to have to be tied to the commercialization of space. We've already started that. You're seeing that the price of launches has come down significantly because of the commercialization of the launch vehicle business. We're starting to see high-end sensors, the cost of high-end sensors come down significantly with advanced technology. Combining that together with the sophisticated ground stations that can integrate all those assets together, and then use that as our ability to get the multiplier effect, to be able to multiply the fact that we can take down an intercontinental ballistic missile. We just don't have enough effectors and enough directed energy weapons today to enable that. Is that?
Yeah, may I just make a point? Yes, we can kill a missile. The question is, can we deter an attack from an enemy like Russia or China. And because they have such a large volume of missiles that they could throw at us, we're only going to deter them if we have the capability of defeating many of those attacking missiles. And my point was we don't have that capability deployed.
Today, that's correct.
Yeah.
General Carlyle, I get your thoughts, especially given the fact that the conversation is starting to shift towards things like hypersonics.
Sure, and I think Senator Kyle's exactly right. We have GBIs, and we know how to do this, and we could do this. We can take out some small number of incoming missiles, but I do think you have to broaden that discussion. I mean, I kind of go back to what Secretary Mattis said at the lunch today. Can we beat Russia? Yes. Can we beat China? Yes. And I believe he's right. But the capacity, which is what Senator Kyle's getting at, is how much of that can we do and how many places at one time can we do? In the ballistic missile, ICBM in particular, would that happen with zero strategic warning? Don't know. I doubt it, but, and then you think about the multiple, talk about deterrence, you think about the triad, which I believe, and I think General John Hyten at Stratcom believes is critical to have all three legs of the triad, because even if we can't stop every missile, the deterrent is, yeah, but we can, there is counter, and there's a lot of capability out there to counter whatever you're doing. And if you have strategic warning, as the saying goes, take out the archer before he shoots the arrow, we can do that too, depending on who the adversary is and where we're going after that. So I agree with what Secretary Mattis said. We have the capability. We need to, in my opinion, strategically develop the technology, and we need to put the effort forth. We need to determine where we're going and make that happen. And then the capacity of what we're going to try to do, and cost imposition is part of that capacity.
Dr. Kennedy, are you already developing that technology? Does some of it already exist out there, and could it be deployed if the government said yes pretty quickly?
There's some elements are in development at low levels. Some I would call it more on the research side, but there's not a full-blown program like the SDI program to go and implement with the deadlines to put that in place. I mean, there's kill vehicle upgrades that have significantly improved the performance of systems. We are developing new missiles. There's a new missile being co-developed with Japan called the SM-3 Block 2A, which has its own kill vehicle on top, and it actually had a very successful test here recently against a very, very challenging threat. And so there is some new that launch vehicle capability that's coming online that can be on Aegis ships, and therefore we can deploy more of them. That could help on some of this capacity issue. The item here relative to the I would call it the layered space sensor element is an element that could go into development today and essentially get into orbit in the near term. So there are elements that can be done. The question is there money set aside in the budget to be able to enable those to be brought online?
Senator Kyle, is there? Could there be?
This is the challenge. The recently released report of the National Defense Strategy Review Commission challenged the Congress in this regard. After agreeing with Secretary Mattis's prioritization of Russia and China as the largest threats that we face over the terrorist and North Korean and Iranian threats, the Commission report said the strategy for dealing with those peer competitors, as well as the lesser competitors, is a sound strategy as long as it's properly resourced. But if we maintain the Budget Control Act, which is the law today and will remain the law unless it's repealed by Congress, it has the potential for sequestration. And if we fund the Defense Department through continuing resolutions rather than the regular appropriation process that the two committee chairmen talked about today, and which is the right way to do it, and unless we increase the top line number, this defense strategy of Secretary Mattis will not be properly resourced, and therefore we won't be able to get to the kind of things we're talking about here.
I just want to take a moment, and I want to just let everybody know that we are accepting questions for this panel. In terms of the live audience, you can submit questions via the RNDF app, the www.rndf2018.org. Plus, for those viewing across the country right now online, you can also submit questions via Twitter at #RNDF. I Probably should have mentioned that at the top, but I'm going to do it now. And we will be setting some time aside for those questions at the end of the panel. Moving on here, General Carlyle, in terms of 2 words, Starry Sky 2.
Say again?
Starry Sky 2. I think it was a hypersonic aircraft that the Chinese tested not that long ago. When you are thinking about hypersonics versus the missile defense systems we have in place right now, when you're thinking about potential adversaries in China or Russia, how quickly does the U.S. need to be moving to put some of these new technologies into play?
I think that's a critical point. I think what you talked about in the Chinese test, if you talk to Dr. Michael Griffin, the head of R&E inside the Pentagon, he'll tell you that that's his highest priority right now. It's what he thinks about every day. We're working on hypersonics. One of the challenges, I think, and Dr. Kennedy can relate to this, is we haven't got that cohesive group. We got a lot, the Army, Navy, and the Air Force are all working on it. We haven't brought that together. If you remember SDI, there was a 3-star general that got put in charge of SDI writ large. I think in the hypersonics discussion, we've got to, again, that's a strategic technology that we cannot allow ourselves to fall behind in anymore, because I think we already are. So I think that the effort that we need to put forward, we need to bring the national labs, we need to bring industry and their expertise, which are paramount to success in that. And then we need to make sure that we're all working together and we're not doing duplicitous work. Again, there's not enough time or money in the budget to do multiple events trying to get to one end game of a hypersonic capability. I do believe, and having talked to Dr. Griffin recently, I do believe that he sees that and he's working hard. And I think, again, I'd ask Dr. Kennedy, but I think he's reached out to industry. I think industry knows the department's interest in it. And the way to move forward is that's one of the key strategic technologies that we have got to move out on.
Dr. Kennedy, when I think about SDI and I think about what the world was like at that point in time, you had President Reagan proposed this vision for missile defense. The ABM was in place. It was really the U.S. versus the USSR. Today, we don't have ABM. We're talking about multiple adversaries, and then we're also talking about missile defense systems that we not only implement ourselves, but we sell to our allies internationally. How has the landscape changed, and how important are those international sales to this conversation?
Well, I would say I'm going to go back to the National Defense Strategy, and one of the founding elements of the National Defense Strategy actually was brought up again by Secretary Mattis today, is our working with our coalition partners. And I just mentioned earlier a development program called the Standard Missile 3 Block 2A, which is a co-development of a ballistic missile killer with a kill vehicle on top between the United States and Japan. So not only is it a sale, it's a co-development. And getting our coalition partners engaged from that perspective, in other words, investing not just in buying the article after the United States develops it, but also in the co-development of it, can significantly reduce the, obviously, cost to the United States and help, get the dollars required to do to be able to put this kind of a capability in place.
Senator Kyle, I want to go back to the point you just made before, and that is, how do you prioritize missile defense and what our defenses need to look like as we move forward and as things like budget and cost become an ever greater focus given our deficit, given a changing Congress?
Let's divide it first into a more localized or theater kind of defense, and then the national homeland protection. We need to protect our military assets wherever they're deployed, and we need missile defense systems that can do that, because our adversaries want to take out those assets as soon as possible. And so we have developed and deployed systems that can do that. That's Patriot and THAAD and some other systems. The Israelis have found the importance of that kind of defense because they've faced the shorter range attacks and been able, through 2 of their missile defense systems, to be able to protect their citizens against those attacks. The more significant question for us, I think here, because it relates to SDI, is the protection of the homeland. And there you're probably mostly talking, at least today, about a ballistic missile intercontinental range launched from an adversary, and right now there are 3 that can do it for sure, and that's North Korea, China, and Russia, and having enough of a protection there to deter the would-be adversary from even thinking of the attack. So while we have the capability of knocking down a very limited number, the question is, does that deter anybody? It might deter the North Koreans if they're deterrable, but it certainly isn't enough to deter China or Russia today. So the point here is to develop, and I would say to answer the question about prioritization, we can, under the treaty, the New START treaty, we can't develop any more nuclear warheads to match Russian warheads. They're supposedly bound by the treaty as we are. Meanwhile, China keeps on building and they're not bound by the treaty. So is there an upside to developing more nuclear warheads? I don't think so. What is another option? To compromise an attack by the opponent and therefore deter them. And I think missile defense represents a good investment if it's done right, the way that my 2 colleagues here have talked about it. It has the potential to really complicate the planning of a Chinese or Russian leader that decides, maybe I can accomplish what I need to by quickly striking the United States, and they can't strike back. If you can demonstrate that you can take your best shot, pal, but you're not going to achieve your objectives because we've got a defense which can defeat a lot of them. Some may leak through, but we can defeat most of them. If we had that in place, just think about the value of the Russian nuclear enterprise today. As President Reagan said, it makes it impotent. It's irrelevant now. So the priority depends upon the costs involved, the time frames, the availability of technology that we can employ, other strategic factors, and you put all that together and develop your defense strategy with the appropriate place here for a missile defense. I would personally put it at a pretty high level in our planning, again, partly because of what I said about what we've already committed to with regard to our offensive strategic capabilities.
Carlyle, I want to get your thoughts on this as well, especially because I think we've kind of established here today that we need more, right? We continue to need more. So from your vantage point, what should be prioritized?
Well, excuse me, my throat.
My timing is off. I can a few moments if you want.
I apologize, but, well, I agree with Senator Kyle. Homeland defense is the first priority. You always have to put that first. I think theater defense and cruise missile defense is something that will come with the technology that Dr. Kennedy's talking about. And it's just a question of that strategic approach to the technology development and where we're going forward. Apologize. Man.
Dr. Kennedy, would you mind picking it up?
Well, I think I'm going to try to see if I can summarize here. I think what we were saying is that we believe, we all 3 of us believe we have the capability of shooting down one of these ballistic missiles. The question is, if multiple are launched, what is your capability there? In other words, capacity. And Senator Kyle used those words there. So in terms of priority, I think you need to make Homeland defense of the homeland the priority, and that's what the ground-based interceptors are about. But these new, like this example, this Standard Missile 3 Block 2A does have an intercontinental ballistic missile kill capability that we can bring online very quickly. It can be launched from Aegis ships. It can be launched from Aegis ashore. So there are things that we can do to start to help us relative to the capacity or the magazine, as sometimes it's a term used in the military. But that does take a budget. That does take money. And it takes the Department of Defense to make that a priority in taking that to Congress. So.
And to that point, Senator Kyle, it's really fascinating when you actually look at the history of missile defense. It's almost been like this, and like it or not, that wave has sort of been ridden based largely on politics. So I think it kind of begs the question: how do active missile defenses contribute to deterrence? And I know you were sort of touching on that before, but just to dig into it a little bit more.
Well, it's politics, but it's also been the threat. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, I think there was a general relaxation in this country about all things defense, not just missile defense. And you do have to match what you're trying to do to the threat. So I look at the new prioritization of the defense strategy by Secretary of Defense right now, who says now we have to really start worrying about Russia again and about China now and in the long term. If that is our number one priority, what is the threat? It is of hundreds of missiles being thrown our way, intercontinental ballistic missiles. There's only one way to deter if Putin decides that we're too much of a impediment to his designs, whatever they may be on Europe or whatever. And we get into a war, and it's not hard to see a thrust into the Baltic countries, for example, waiting to see what the NATO response is, and we don't have enough to stop them from taking over the Baltic countries, so now they're in, and now we've got to get them out, and digging them out is a lot harder than getting them in. So that may require a significant use of U.S. military and NATO assets. He then decides to use tactical nuclear weapons under his new doctrine of escalate to de-escalate, meaning I'm going to show them that I'm willing to use nuclear weapons, and I'll basically challenge them to decide whether they are too. Well, today we have nuclear weapons that can cause an enormous amount of destruction all over Russia. But what we don't have, except in one case, is a dialable weapon or a very low-yield weapon or other kinds of weapons like with a lot of radiation as opposed to blast capability. In other words, a kind of weapon that we might want to use in that context to prevent us from escalating all the way up to the big weapon. And that is an area I think we need a lot more discussion about. It's been recommended as part of the Nuclear Posture Review. The National Defense Strategy Commission picked up on it and agrees with that. That's one of the things that we could use to deter a Russia, for example. And the other is to develop a kind of missile defense that would so complicate the planning that even if they're going to send 200 missiles over and they only figure 40 of them are going to get through, will they really have achieved their objective? And if we can do that for a cost that fits into our national strategy, to me that is the most logical way to prevent war from ever breaking out. And after all, that's what we're talking about here, folks. If we ever get into a nuclear conflagration with Russia or China, it is virtually unthinkable, as Ronald Reagan put it. Just think about the horrors of what that would involve. You've got to stop it from ever occurring, and that means you have to stop an adversary from miscalculating. And how do you do that? By being strong enough in many different ways that it's just too hard for the other side to plan around that and to know that that adversary can succeed in an attack. That's called deterrence, and I think missile defense can play a very large role in that.
General Carlyle,
I'm appropriately recovered, yeah. I apologize.
I didn't want to put you back on the spot there.
No, that's fine.
But I want to pose the same question to you, which is how do active missile defenses contribute to deterrence?
Well, I think Senator Kyle's exactly right. As President Reagan called it, the suicide pact of MAD is not the right answer. I don't think American people want that. I don't think the people of the world want that. And I guess the dialogue or the discussion that goes on is if you develop an exquisite missile defense capability, is that destabilizing or stabilizing? I think it's something that you got to look at for what it is, and that is your ability to defend your people. It's not an offensive weapon. It renders an opponent's capability less capable. The swarm is a challenge. But even given the argument over stability versus instability, it is the right answer to go down versus a suicide pact of mutually assured destruction. And so I think that, and if you look at the other strength of the United States that's not often talked about is our friends and partners, our allies, that we build by, with, and through, as Secretary Mattis said, which we all, I lived it, most people in uniform lived it their whole lives, is when we build that, we have friends and partners. And so if you build a missile defense capability and you have nations like China and Russia, they don't. So even if it's destabilizing with those two particular regimes, you kind of go, this is the right way to go to protect our people, our way of life, world order, and our friends, partners, and allies.
I want to take some questions from the audience right now, and I'll pose them to all three of you. Senator Kyle, I'll start with you. Will the U.S. withdrawal from the INF Treaty result in a substantial U.S. investment in ballistic missiles? Should we make such an investment?
Russia has been in violation of the INF Treaty, as I think you've heard earlier today, for over 5 years, and is clearly not going to come into compliance. It would be very difficult for them now to come into compliance since they've already deployed these systems. And the only alternative for the United States is to withdraw from the treaty. No other country is bound by a treaty like that, so it's just Russia and the United States. The question is, what would the United States do when we withdrew from the treaty? It's not just to say that the treaty no longer exists because you're violating it. We need to do something to respond to the threat. How they violated it was to develop a cruise missile with a range between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. Intermediate range is kind of what it's called. And they're very hard to deal with because unlike a ballistic missile, which has a lot of minutes going up and coming back down again, cruise missile is hard to detect. There's not very much time to pick it up, to track it, and it's not easy to have a weapon that can intercept it. So this is an effective weapon that Putin has clearly calculated is worth having despite whatever costs we may come up with. So we pull out of the treaty. So what? He's still got a very effective threat in the European theater. And so you got to develop defenses against it, and they could be anything from directed energy and lasers to some kind of cyber or other kind of threat that deals with non-kinetic threat, I'll put it that way, or even a kinetic capability to defend. But you may also have to develop your own similar kind of weapon to have the capability in theater that the Russians then have. And I know that we have, from a congressional standpoint, authorized the Defense Department to begin looking into these things, but I don't think they've had much time to do much about it yet. But the President will end up withdrawing from the treaty sometime in the relatively near future, I think.
All right, we have less than a minute and a half, so we're going to move through this very, very quickly. Maybe just a sentence or two from both of you, and then I'll do the last question very quickly. Dr. Kennedy.
So as citizens of the United States, I challenge you to get together with your senators and your congressmen and congresswomen and make sure that they understand the importance of missile defense to you as a citizen of the United States, because as you probably heard here today, that the proliferation of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles that could challenge our homeland are out there, and we need to ensure that we take the technology that we have in hand today and put it in place to protect the citizens of our country, the sovereignty of our nation. And I think that's very important. But unless the halls of Congress hear those words, it doesn't do us any good because we can't get the funding to move forward.
Okay, next question. General Carlyle, which organization should lead the development of a new space sensor layer for missile defense? MDA, the Air Force, or a new Space Force?
The hot potato.
Yeah, thanks for that question. At the end of the day, I think, as I said earlier, I think the increased dialogue on the need to be able to do all the things we do in space situational awareness, you need to know what's going on up there, you need to be able to defend your own assets because they're critical, and we will evolve to different types of capabilities in space to do different things in support of this nation. So I think the dialogue has been great. I really believe that today we're standing up a unified command, a space unified command, and that is the place where that should take place. I think because when you think about it, it's the Army portion of space, the Navy portion of space, the Air Force portion of space, and then you have the intel portion of space, include NSA, NRO, and all of their assets. So I really think a unified space command that has interagency capability with the intel world is where that should occur. And again, I believe the dialogue on space is, John Hyten and Jay Raymond will tell you, this is exactly what this country needed to do, is start talking about it, get the dialogue, have the discussion. as we go forward. But the new Space Command that is in the process of being stood up, and I believe by 1 January will be at least initially operational, should be the place that occurs.
I wish I had another 45 minutes with you, but I don't. Our time is up. So I say thank you to all three of you for a wonderful panel. Senator John Kyle, Dr. Tom Kennedy, and General Hawk Carlisle. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.